Welcome back. Quite a while ago, we talked about the Exodus from Egypt. So there was Abraham, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and his descendants became known as the Israelites. Well, they end up living in Egypt, and over time they become enslaved. And they lived there for 400 years. They spent a lot of that time in slavery, and the slavery and oppression got worse and worse. And so eventually the Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt, was putting to death the male babies of the Israelites. He commanded that all babies born, if it's male, you throw it in the Nile. And he's killing every baby to try to reduce the population of these Israelites. Well, God sent Moses to go in and bring the people out of Egypt, out of slavery and oppression. The word used in Scripture is God gave them salvation from Egypt. They were saved from the Egyptians and from slavery. So to do this, God unleashed a whole bunch of plagues on Egypt. So they're the 10 plagues. The last of these plagues is known as the Passover. And in this particular plague, God is, the Bible says God's going to war with all the gods of Egypt through these plagues. Each plague attacks a certain god or a number of gods of Egypt. This last one, the Pharaoh himself was considered divine. And so this last plague, among other things, was targeting Pharaoh and his inability to do anything against the Lord. Can't even protect his family. So God said, I'm going to go through the land of Egypt, and I'm going to go to every single household in Egypt and kill the firstborn male in every household. So that sounds pretty harsh, but you got to keep two things in mind, all right? This is actually one of the passages in Scripture that makes me a little uncomfortable as a modern Western thinking person. But first of all, one of the things that helps me is realizing that the Pharaoh was killing every firstborn, every baby of the Israelites. Every male child that's born, throw it in the Nile. All right, so God is doing the same thing to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but kind of toned down. But even that leaves me a little uncomfortable. The other thing, though, is that God gave them a way out. He said, and very specifically, he's talking to the Israelites, but this holds for anybody in all Egypt. You would offer sacrifices, and that was a normal thing. Most people in most cultures offered sacrifices to the gods. It sounds pretty brutal and disgusting, barbaric today because we get our meat from ShopRite or something, but back then, if you want meat, if you're going to have a barbecue, you go out back and get Betsy, the cow, and, cook her up. So it was just a bloody thing, and that was part of life. People were used to it. So God's saying, make a sacrifice. You're going to eat the meat from the sacrifice, but here's what you're going to do. When you slaughter the animal, before you prepare it for food, you drain the blood a certain way, and then you take some leaves, and you dip the leaves in the blood, and take the blood and put it on the doorposts of your house, right? So you go to the front door, and on the doorpost, you dip these leaves in blood and use it like a paintbrush to paint that blood from the sacrifice on the doorpost of the house. And when I go through the land of Egypt, God says, when I see the blood on the doorposts, I will pass over that house. Nobody in that house will be harmed. So anybody in Egypt, including Pharaoh himself, could have done this. So God gave a way out. Well, the time came, and it was this huge thing. The Egyptians were just in shock and grief. There were a lot of dead firstborn sons, and it was a horrible time. They threw the Israelites out of the land. They just drove them out. God knew this was going to happen, and God knew that they were going to have to pick up and leave in a hurry. So God basically said, pack your bags, get only the essentials, bring your toothbrush, a couple changes of clothes, whatever the slave owners give you to take with you, just take it. But make bread because you're going to need food. But when you make bread, you're going to have to leave in a hurry, so you're not going to have time to let the dough rise. So you'd make dough, and normally you'd put yeast in the dough, or leaven, and that would kind of spread throughout the dough. And over time, that dough would rise into the fluffy, delicious bread that like we think of it. But in this case, God said, you're not going to have time to do that. So don't put yeast in the bread. Don't wait for the bread to rise. Just cook it. In Hebrew, the word is matzah, unleavened bread. So you're going to make this bread and have it ready to go so you have some sustenance, because it's going to be a long journey without, there's no Burger Kings on the way. So have this ready to go. So another thing that God commanded them is that every single year at this time of year, you're going to celebrate the Passover and this unleavened bread. And so God established two feasts that kind of go hand in hand. The Passover, you're sacrificing an animal and kind of reliving that whole Passover meal that you would have eaten, that the ancestors would have eaten that night. And you get rid of anything with leaven or yeast in it from your house, and you only eat unleavened bread for 7 days, and that's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And when God commanded these things, it was very specific, according to Scripture, to do this as sort of we would say, remembering the Passover and remembering this original Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's a little different in the Middle East in that we view time differently. So in the West, for me, I think of time, we start at creation, and then there's this kind of straight timeline going through, either infinitely or from a Christian perspective, when the Lord returns, time as we know it ends, and we have start, finish, and just that line. So we're in here somewhere, and we look back and remember something from the past. We remember the Passover feast. Well, for the Jews and the Middle Eastern people, it's a cyclical timeline, a cycle. So you start here at creation, and you go around in a circle. Think of like a spring or a slinky. You go all the way around that circle and come back to that same exact point, just one rung higher on that slinky. And then you go around another year and another year. So if here's creation, we're way up here in whatever year we're in, and you keep going around and around. But when you get to this point, you're basically reliving the Passover with your ancestors in a very, very literal sense for the Middle Eastern people. And so God, it's not just look back and remember that it happened, it's relive this experience. And that's what the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are really meant to be, reliving this thing. And God gave specific instructions. He said things like, this will be a memorial to you. You're to celebrate this as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. It's a permanent ordinance. So for the Jewish people, this is permanent. Every year you do this, no matter what. You shall also observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On this very day, tonight, you'll be driven out of the land of Egypt, and so therefore you'll observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. And the point is, this whole ordinance, this reliving of this thing, it's all about God delivering them from Egypt. It's the salvation from Egypt and from their oppression. When their children say to you, "What does this mean to you?" you shall say, "It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes." And the people bowed low and worshipped. And then a little bit later on in Exodus, "You shall tell your son on that day, saying, 'It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt.'" In other words, the Torah, or the law, the covenant God made with the people through Moses, commands that every year they celebrate this combination of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread as a memory, a memorial of what God has done, giving them salvation from Egypt. And it has everything to do with God delivering them from their enemies in Egypt and bringing them out of Egypt and making them into an independent nation. All right, so that's sort of a summary of the whole thing. Well, God also, he made a covenant with Abraham to give them land and give Abraham land and descendants. He made a covenant with David that one of his descendants would always reign as king on the throne in Jerusalem forever. And then in Jeremiah, God promised a new covenant. And God said, it won't be like that covenant that I made with them already through Moses, the covenant that they broke, God adds. Then it's not going to be like that, but this covenant will be written on their hearts. This covenant will involve the forgiveness of sin and a bunch of other things. All right, so fast forward now to where we left off. The people, the religious leaders, they were trying to stop Jesus because they really fully believed that Jesus was going to get them all killed. Jesus was claiming to be that king in the line of David that God promised to David, this descendant of David who would rise up against their enemies and restore the world to peace and it was going to be this massive war that would end in peace with this son of David, a descendant of David, on the throne in Jerusalem as an independent nation. And he would give Israel salvation from their enemies. Jesus claimed to be Messiah, that anointed king. That's what Messiah means, the anointed one, or the anointed king in the line of David. And the religious leaders had their minds made up. This cannot be the anointed king. And it just made sense to them. Jesus was doing things that were pretty much straight out blasphemy if they weren't true. And Messiah would never commit blasphemy. Messiah would never violate our Sabbath laws and all these things. So this can't be Messiah, but he's got so many followers that if he rises up against Rome thinking he's Messiah, then Rome will come in, and it's not going to be putting down a rebellion. It's going to be going to war with this army. So they're trying to stop Jesus, and time after time they fail. And they finally make up their minds, no matter what we do, it's failing miserably. Well, one of Jesus' apostles, one of his sort of inner circle, betrayed him. And that's Judas. Most of us have heard the name Judas at some point, and people who were named Judas a lot of times started going by Jude because they didn't want to be associated with Judas. Well, Judas went to these Pharisees, these religious leaders, and said, I know the predicament you're in. You can't arrest Jesus publicly because it'll start a riot, and again, Roman army will come in, and it'll go very badly. You can't shame him because he keeps turning the tables on you. Everything you're trying is failing. What you need to do is find a way to get him when there are no crowds around. And Judas said, I'm in his inner circle. I know his routine. I know where he goes, what he does. I can get him to you in a place where nobody else will find out about it until after the fact, and you can do what you like with him. There are various reasons why Judas may have done this, and we can speculate about all that another time, but just for now, he did it. He is willing to turn Jesus over to these religious leaders so that they can put a stop to it. So he sets all this up. Well, Jesus knew this was going to happen, and he knew that he would be put to death soon. And he wanted to make sure that nothing interrupted this last Passover celebration. And so he arranged it in a way where the apostles themselves didn't even know where it was going to be until the last minute. But he got everything set up. They all sat down for dinner, and he said to these the 12 apostles, he said, I've eagerly desired to share this meal with you. In other words, I've been looking forward to this meal with you. Now, the apostles had been following Jesus probably for 3 years, which means this is probably the third Passover that they've experienced with him. So 2 Passovers with him before. It's possible there was just one, depending on how the time works out, but probably 2. And before, whenever they were having the Passover with Jesus before, Jesus would follow what the Torah says. The Torah commands, right? This is the first 5 books of the Bible with the law of Moses, commands that you celebrate the Passover every year, that you celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread every year, and it's all about remembering God, delivering the people from Egypt. That's what this is all about. God delivered us from Egypt. He made us an independent nation. And so the first 2 Passovers, they're all sitting around the table, and at the right moment, Jesus would take a piece of matzah from the table, this unleavened bread, and he would hold it up, and as he holds up this matzah, he breaks it, and he would say, this is the bread. Essentially, I'm going to butcher what the Jews say here, but it's basically, this is the bread that our ancestors ate coming out of the land of Egypt. And the Jews have formalized over time what would be said and when, and there's certain blessings and certain sayings, a big ceremony around it. But Jesus would have taken that bread, broken it, and said, this is the bread that our ancestors ate coming out of the land of Egypt. And you would go on to tell the whole story of the plagues and deliverance and becoming an independent nation and all these things. So the first 2 times Jesus did that, and then over time, the Jews added wine to the celebration. I'm guessing earlier on, that they added this, but wine was an important part of the celebration. And there'd be 4 cups of wine, and the same thing. This wine all was pointing to certain parts of the journey out of Egypt, certain parts of God's deliverance from Egypt. So Jesus would have taken the wine and given the typical blessing. This wine represents, I forget which cup it was off the top of my head because I don't have notes in front of me, but it's basically this wine represents the blood that was shed, whatever it was, and but it was all about Egypt. Everything that you do in this was God delivering us from Egypt, bringing us into to be our own nation. So here's this Passover, and all the apostles, just like the other 2 times, they're sitting around Jesus. They recline at a table. You don't sit up like we do today in the West, but you kind of recline, and there's this big tray full of food. And Jesus took this matzah, and he held it up, and he said, "This bread," and he's breaking the bread, and the apostles all start mouthing with him, "This bread is the bread that our ancestors ate coming out of Egypt." And Jesus interrupts the flow by breaking the bread and saying, "This bread is my body broken for you." And I guarantee you, the eyes of every single man in the room got this big. Their mouths were hanging open. Did he just say what I think he just said? Because the Torah commands that when Jesus do this, he breaks the bread and talks about God delivering them from Egypt. This bread is all about God's deliverance from Egypt. Jesus said, "Forget all that. This isn't about Egypt. It's about me." Right? Forget the 1,000 years of tradition that, it's not about all the tradition and all that. This is all about me. And you can't get too much more blasphemous than that. I mean, he may as well just said, "I am the Lord." It would have utterly shocked them. Jesus broke the Torah. Jesus just violated the Torah in an atrocious way. And then he took the cup of wine, and he said, "This wine, it's not about Egypt. It's not about God's deliverance out of Egypt and the nation of Israel. This wine is my blood poured out for you." And he specifically says here, this cup is the blood of the new covenant. And the apostles would have all said, "Wait, what?" But as Jews, they would also immediately think, new covenant, Jeremiah. This is the new covenant that God promised through Jeremiah. Not like the covenant that I made with the people through Moses, but this new covenant. And they'd be thinking about all that. And they start realizing Jesus is doing something, either he's a nut job and he's committed the worst kind of blasphemy, or he's insane, or he's doing something that we just don't get yet. But this is, whatever it is, this is deep and big and profound. And they're utterly shocked. So what in the world is going on? Well, by starting this new covenant, by saying this cup is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, he's basically saying the covenant that God made with Israel, that you all, my apostles, are under, that's done. Jesus is saying, I am about to go fulfill that whole covenant on your behalf. And my blood is going to bring this new covenant that God promised. Now, none of this would make any sense to the apostles at this point. They're all just puzzled over it. But Jesus, he violated the Torah, he shocked everybody, and then just hinted at the explanation. Something huge is going on. Well, after this, Jesus went on a long discourse, and he was preparing them for everything that was to come, because things were about to get really bad. And Jesus was saying, basically, I'm going to die. Here's what you need to know. And he was teaching them. And he started out by saying, remember back when I sent you all out by twos, right? Teamed you up, and you all went out town to town and spreading the gospel message. The kingdom of God is at hand. And they're all like, yeah, we remember. He said, well, remember I told you, if you have don't bring an extra pair of sandals, don't bring more than one change of clothes, just whatever you have, go with that. Don't bring a sword with you, etc. Now, though, the time has come where I tell you now, whoever doesn't have a sword, go out and buy one. And Jesus wasn't meaning that literally, he was using it figuratively to say things are about to get really shaken up here. It's going to be different from that. Brace yourself. Well, Peter, of course, I love Peter. I can kind of relate to him, at least on some level. Peter just fixated on that one last comment. Whoever, if you don't have a sword, go buy one. And Jesus kept teaching all this profound stuff that they all needed to know. And Peter kind of heard blah, 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 sword, right? And so Jesus starts wrapping up this whole thing, and profound moment of teaching. And Peter said, oh, I know where there's a sword. And he got up and went over and, pulled the sword out of a closet or wherever he went. And came back, and Jesus just kind of said, oh, that's enough. So Jesus took his very closest friends, the three of them, and they went out to a place where he goes to pray. And they got out there in this garden, and it was on the Mount of Olives. There's in the city of Jerusalem, right near the wall, the wall on the west part of the city, that's where the temple stood. And just on the other side of the city wall, there's a valley, and then on the other side of that valley is the Mount of Olives. And they went up on the Mount of Olives, really just nice, quiet place. And Jesus said, guys, he's about to start sweating blood, which is something that I've read can happen. It's a medical condition when you're under extraordinary stress. It can happen. And he was like, guys, I just need you to be here, right? Just stay here and pray. I'm going over there to pray. And the guys kept falling asleep. So Jesus was over there praying, and he prayed, and very specifically, the Bible tells us that he said, Father, if there is any other way, let this cup pass from me. In other words, if there's any other way to accomplish this thing, let's do it the other way. Jesus is terrified. There's so much anxiety. He's about to take the sins of all the world, past, present, and future, on him and pay the punishment for it all. And it's overwhelming. And he came back to the guys, and they're sound asleep. So he woke them up, and he said, guys, I really need you now. Can't you just stay awake for a little while? Just stay here and pray. All right, so he went back off again and started praying again. We find out that he prayed 3 times. Lord, if there is any other way, let this cup pass from me. Right? Why did he pray that 3 times? Why did he have to? There was another time where he prayed out loud. It was when Lazarus was being raised from the dead. And he made a point of saying, Father, thank you that you've heard me. And I mean, you always hear me, but I'm just saying this out loud now because I want them all to hear me praying to you so that they know that you're doing it. And he went on this big kind of tangent. Well, here, back there we saw God's intimacy with Jesus, that really close, tight relationship they had. Usually Jesus isn't even praying out loud. It's just this constant flow of conversation. Now Jesus goes out and he says, God, Lord, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. And then he has to say it again and again. And he's not pestering. It's not that he didn't like God's answer. It's that there was no answer. Lord, I'm terrified. If there's any other way, let this thing pass from me. And he heard nothing in response. Right? Jesus and the Father, he even said one time, God, me and the Father are one. I and the Father are one. They have that tight, intimate, ultra intimate connection. And here he hears absolutely nothing from his Father. And after the 3rd time he comes back, and here comes Judas with a whole bunch of soldiers. These are people from the Sanhedrin. They're not Romans. These are Jewish soldiers. But they come to arrest Jesus. Now Peter, back at the table, right, Jesus, he announced at the table, one of you will betray me. And he was talking about Judas. But if you've read through the scripture, you might have caught that one by one, all the apostles start to say, Lord, is it me who will betray you? Right? Judas wasn't like this creepy looking guy with one of those curly mustaches. Or, he didn't look like, this, like he would in the movies about him. Or, he wasn't this evil looking guy. Nobody suspected him. It wasn't like, oh, I bet it's Judas. They all said, is it me? Like, all of them knew they had it in them. But Peter, of the bunch, he was the one who said, Jesus, I will die for you. I will never do that to you. I would never betray you. I will die. I'll go to the grave for you. And he meant it, absolutely meant it with all his heart. Well, then Jesus was giving that little discourse, and Peter found his sword, because that's the only word he heard, the whole thing was sword. So here he is with his sword. And this group of soldiers comes to take Jesus. Now, the typical greeting in the Middle East is a kiss on either cheek. Judas went up to Jesus, and he had the sign prepared. Guys, the one, in case they didn't know already, the one that I kiss is the one that you're to arrest. And he came up and kissed Jesus on either cheek, the typical greeting. It's saying hello or a handshake. And Jesus said, Judas, it's bad enough that you're doing this to me, but you betray me with a kiss. Right? Well, they come and arrest Jesus. Now, the three guys there, Peter, James, and John, Jesus' closest friends, they start to realize whatever Jesus is up to, it's starting now. They believe Jesus is Messiah. Messiah, by definition, is the king in the line of David who will rise up against the enemies of God and restore peace to the world and sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem forever. This is all starting. Peter grabs his sword, and he is ready to fight and die for Jesus. And he approaches the soldiers and starts swinging his sword. And the Bible tells us that there was a servant there, and Peter cut off the servant's right ear. All right, so as I'm facing the camera, this would be my right ear. So imagine if you're, facing me, this would be your right hand. It would be really awkward to get your sword into a position where you kind of go around my head and slice off my ear. If we're in combat or something like that, you'd be much more likely to slice my left ear off. So either Peter was left-handed, gives him a shot, or more likely, this servant saw Peter raise his sword, and the servant's eyes got this big, and he just turned around and ran. Now his back's to Peter, and Peter swings, and off goes the ear. Either way, dude's ear is off. Jesus yells at Peter, knock it off. That's enough. Put it away. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And Peter's caught off guard by that. I mean, he's ready to go at it. He's going to swing his sword at anybody that moves, and he's going to take out these guards and keep going because here we go. We're ready for this. And Jesus rebukes him and tells him to put his sword away. And it's like Peter did something wrong here. Peter's just baffled. He feels betrayed even, right? I'm willing to fight and die for you, and you're yelling at me instead of the enemy? Like, what's going on? Well, Jesus picks up the guy's ear off the ground, brushes it off, puts it back on his head, and he's healed. And Peter's watching all this, feeling really betrayed. Meanwhile, Jesus just saved Peter's life, because they're arresting Jesus. If they go back and this guy's missing an ear and they say, what happened to you? Well, this guy Peter who was with him attacked us and cut my ear off. Right? I always think of the Monty Python thing. They go back and report Peter now for cutting somebody's ear off, and they say it was him, and they all look at his ear and it's fine, and he goes, I got better. And that would be nobody's going to take it seriously if the guy has his ear on. So really, Jesus just saved Peter's life. But Peter feels extremely betrayed here. And so you got to keep that in mind as we see Peter's actions next. So they take Jesus off. Peter follows behind to see what's going to happen. They take him to where the Sanhedrin would meet, and they have this completely illegal meeting and trial. Nothing that they do there really is legal. It's a mockery of a trial, just trying to find some accusation that they can take to Rome. Only Rome could sentence him to death legally. So they're trying to find some way to sentence him to death and have the Romans do it so that they don't, the wrath of Rome doesn't come down on them. Right, but Peter follows from a distance. He gets into this little courtyard right outside the building just before they shut and lock the gates. And somebody comes up to him and says, "You're one of them, aren't you? You were with him." And he says, "Absolutely not. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know that guy. I just came in here to warm up by the fire for a little while. That's it." And kind of walks away. And meanwhile, Jesus is in this room getting interrogated. People are trying to accuse him of stuff, and none of their testimonies are matching. Back to Peter, right? Somebody else comes up and says, "You were with him. I think I recognize you. You were with that Jesus guy." Just, "Absolutely not. I was not with Jesus. I don't know who you're talking about. Just leave me alone." And then back in the building, they finally find some way to accuse Jesus. The high priest, I believe it was, asked him directly, "Are you Messiah?" Some translations would say the Christ. And Christ and Messiah are the same word. "Are you the anointed one in the line of David?" And he says, "It is as you say." And he tears his robes and he says, "You've heard it. He's committing treason. He's claiming to be our king. And let's take him to Rome." So as they're bringing him out of the house to drag him off to Rome, Peter encounters another person who says, "You were with him. I recognize your accent." And Peter's like, "No," and he starts calling down curses on himself, right? Not like swear words, though I wouldn't doubt that either, but it's not like swear words. It's more like, "May I be damned to hell if I know that person." And as he says this, they're leading Jesus out of the house, and the sun is just coming up. He hears a rooster crow, and he remembers back at the house, he told Jesus, "I will never betray you." And Jesus said, "Peter, sadly you will. And I tell you the truth, 3 times you're going to deny me tonight before the rooster crows in the morning." And Peter just gets done saying, "May I be damned to hell if I've done this, if I knew this man." And he looks up, and there's Jesus being led away to a certain death. And he hears a rooster crow, and he and Jesus lock eyes, and he just falls on his knees grieving. He is so confused and so hurt and guilty. He can't, it takes him a long time to get past this. He has just betrayed the one that he swore his allegiance to, and meant it. And he picked up a sword to die and to fight and maybe even die for Jesus. He meant it. And here he is denying that he even knew him. And he's starting to think all these thoughts. What is he doing? He's going to die now. They're going to kill him. And now what do I do? I've wasted 3 years of my life following him. And yet he was my best friend. He was my closest friend, and he's like family. But look what he did to me. He publicly shamed me, and he yelled at me when I was trying to defend him. Like, all these conflicting thoughts. And I guarantee all of the apostles and most or all of the disciples are thinking all these same things. So Jesus is led off to trial with Rome, and pretty much everybody knows at this point how it's going to go. They're going to have to put Jesus to death, and what conflict these people are facing. So in the next session, we'll address the death of Jesus.